Hi, I'm John Bray. I'm the author of The End, and you are listening to and/or watching So Booking Cool.
Hi, this is Josh Cleland. I am the illustrator for The End, and you're on So Booking Cool.
So booking, so booking, so booking cool.
That's so motherfucking cool. So listen to So Booking Cool.
Welcome to So Booking Cool, it's Jewel B. Today's guests are two talents in children's publishing who have come together for a timeless story. One is an illustrator of over a decade whose work can be found in many children's books, billboards, iOS apps, album covers, websites, and a host of publications. The other won a book design contest in his youth before becoming a published author. His new book, The End, explores conclusions and is perfect for little readers who are celebrating their first. Currently, the book is already the #1 release in Children's Time books on Amazon. It also has a starred review from Kirkus. Here with us today are author John Bray and illustrator Josh Cleland. Stay tuned for our conversation, only on So Booking Cool.
Hey, Jewel, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Of course, it is an absolute pleasure. So what I've heard is that a lot of music artists, when their album comes out, they will buy copies of it. So do authors and illustrators do the same?
That's a good question. I mean, on my end, I'll probably buy a couple and probably end up giving most of them away. I mean, I'd like one on the shelf, but otherwise, I don't like to have stuff around. So the thought of having a bunch of copies gives me a little anxiety.
Okay, yeah, you don't like for things to get Go ahead, Josh.
Feedback? Oh, okay. We get copies from the publisher. And then beyond that, like if I have events or anything like that I'll be selling books, we get to buy those and then sell them at the events. But I don't like to, kind of like what John said, I don't like to, buy too many. I mean, I have boxes in my closet of books that I still have yet to sell. So, yeah.
Okay. And you know what? I didn't mean to say cluttered. That was not the choice of word. That wasn't what I was going to say at all.
No.
Yeah, it can't be cluttered with, your precious work and everything. I just meant, I know there are some people who they feel like if they don't really like to have a lot of things in their house if they feel like they're not really using it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's actually, I don't really look at it as clutter, I guess. I haven't done many events with COVID, so I haven't really purchased a lot of books in the last couple of years. But I do try to keep a good amount on hand in my studio here.
I love that. By the way, What would you say are some discoveries that came to you during quarantine?
Wow. I tend to be I'm very introverted. I have a close circle and I tend to be very introverted. And I think COVID made me realize that I'm not as introverted as I thought, because with being at home so long and I think part of it is just being forced to be home, which in some sense it's a privilege. I mean, it's great to be able to work from home. So I had that privilege, but not being around people for so long made me realize that I have a bit of extroversion and I need to feed that just for mental health, I think.
I mean, I can relate to that. I've got an introverted kind of bent too. And so I think at the beginning of the pandemic, I kind of feel like there's like stages of the pandemic because it kind of went on so long. There's the quarantine part of it. At the beginning, I felt like, and I feel like a lot of people had this kind of like reaction that we had to like give back. Like there was this like need to give back. So I felt like it really kind of, I had to do something. So at the beginning, the first few months, I just started creating a bunch of artwork. Like I just had to like draw. And then I started drawing artwork for kids who weren't able to celebrate their birthdays in the pandemic. I just put the word out and say, hey, parents, do you have kids that have your have your birthday parties canceled. I'll draw them a birthday card for you. And so that just that was a way for me to just kind of keep going and keep positive. And I felt like some of the realizations I had was that it just kind of required a lot more thinking, a lot more thought. And I just couldn't take things for granted anymore. I just had to be very intentional with my mindset and how I give back and as an artist, So, yeah.
It's interesting that you turned to creating continuously or creating more. On my end, I kept writing and writing and writing, and I was seeing all over social media creators of all sorts kind of talking to each other about how it's okay to not create during this really difficult time, which I 100% respect, but I just felt the exact opposite. Like I couldn't imagine not getting through that period without that creative process, without writing, without staying busy, without doing something.
Yeah, I think I swung from one extreme to the other. I was like, I wanted to create, and then I didn't want to create, and then I wanted to create, and it was definitely a swing. And one April, like March, I just wanted to create, and then April, and then I didn't, and then yeah.
Wow. So speaking of creating, during the publishing process for The End, and in general, authors and illustrators don't usually meet during those times. So what was it like for you guys when you first met?
Well, it was 2-3 weeks ago, right, Josh?
Yeah, we did an Instagram Live.
Yeah. That was the first time. I mean, we'd emailed a couple times or exchanged on social media, but it was only weird because we had been kind of working together for so long. Not like to not have met before then, but it really wasn't weird. I mean, we'd both been working in our own way on the same story at some point. So we had, the significant common ground, but it was weird to think that, I spent however long on the book and then you spent however long on the book, and we never crossed paths at all because that's just how it's set up,
Yeah. If you go the independent route, that's when the author and the illustrator have a very close collaboration. But the traditional publishing, it's pretty separate, and it's mostly with the art director, creative director, things like that. I always think it's fun meeting the author for the first time and just kind of getting your perspective on the whole process. And, because it's such a, I sit down with it, and it's such a personal thing. And John, you can relate, I'm sure, when you're writing the book, it's such a personal thing. You feel like it's just yours, you in your studio or wherever you're writing or creating. And then you kind of forget that this is for other people, or this is somebody else's story that they wrote. So it's always fun to kind of reconnect or connect for the first time even, and just kind of get kind of like how you were experiencing things and stuff during the process.
Well, yeah, I think that's the key. Is like it is an individual process for both of us, but then to sit down and hear, what pages or pieces of the book did you really focus on? Did you really enjoy? Were a bigger challenge? And then on my end, what were because we both have our own snags along the way, but neither one of us knows what they are as this thing is being created. Mm-hmm. So to figure, because there was always this thought in my mind, like, I wonder if this page or this spread, drove him crazy. I wonder if this one was really hard, or if this happened, and there's no way to know,
Yeah.
And I suppose I could have emailed my editor. Exactly.
Like that.
Right. And I'm sure that if I had emailed Allison at the time, she would have said, "Oh no, he's fine. He's fine." But yeah, it was nice to hear, kind of get the background to what created this finished piece.
Thank you both for that. So John, for example, for those who don't know, who are you working closely with when you're working on In the End? And then Josh, I want you to tell us as well.
Sure. So at Starry Forest, I worked with my editor, who was Allison Hunter Hill at the time, and now Amy Dixon. But primarily getting it to the point before it got to Josh, like getting it to its final state of the manuscript, it was with Allison, and it was weeks of kind of batting back and forth these different edits that weren't even so much edits. I mean, they were edits, but they were just so fine. So it was, do we want a comma here? Or do we like the way that it reads without a comma, even if it might not be grammatically correct? Do we want, the line to break after this word or after this word? And it was just fine tuning that. And then that process honestly continued even after some of the spreads from Josh, because seeing the illustrations and seeing where the text could go or how it could fit around the main character and the scene, kind of made us reevaluate some of those line breaks on a few of the pages as well. But that was my primary contact, so I would work closely with her.
Yeah, I worked with a little bit with Allison, and then mostly with Chad Beckerman, who was the book designer. And it's mostly like just email back and forth was with Chad, a little bit of FaceTime. But it's a lot of that interaction is very, very loose, very minimal. I would just kind of do I would rough out all the story, just thumbnails, kind of storyboarding, send that to Chad, get some feedback from him, and then some from Allison, and then I would just continue on my way. I think in the interim, I think they would send it off to you, John, for some thoughts, or some other people in the Starry Forest organization. But it was very minimal, but the collaboration, I think, was very valuable, especially for this book. It was such a conceptual book, so it required a lot of like some back and forth, more than another book may.
Right.
Required.
Yeah, it's like an organized game of telephone is really what it is. Like you'd go to Chad, and then it sounds like sometimes you'd maybe work directly with Allison, but it sounds like you'd go to Chad would go to Allison would come to me, and then it would bounce all the way back. And I don't ever think anything was lost in that chain, but it's just kind of the nature of things. And then everyone has their own schedule and their own projects going on. So it's not, that process can take some time to get from one end to the other. It worked well.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book that people need to check out. Something that I love about The End is that it's getting children to think about how to apply that to their everyday lives. Because I think a lot of the times they'll think of the end in terms of a book and in terms of a movie and maybe a show. So how did the idea come about?
The idea originally is from a line in a Semisonic song that came out in 1999, I think. And it's a line from Seneca, from a philosopher, but the line is, every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. That line I loved the song when it came out, and I still love the song. But that line is kind of stuck in my head, and I just started to think about what that meant to me and how I understand that concept. And I started to realize it's really basic when you think about it. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end, but it's not a basic concept to kind of internalize and truly understand to the point where you realize that you have to have endings in order to have beginnings. And I kind of wanted to explore that at a level for kids, in part because you're so restricted on word count and page count that it forces you to really distill these ideas down to the absolute bare minimum while still conveying the concept. And that's sort of where I went with it. So I just ran with that idea and then just kept editing and shifting and moving, and yeah.
And Josh, how did you get approached to illustrate The End?
Well, Robert with Starry Forest reached out to me, which is pretty typical, and just asked, just gave me a synopsis of the story, the concept of it. And that really actually intrigued me. I really thought it was a really cool idea. And I can't remember if he sent me the manuscript first before I said yes or not. I think he did. And I read it, because I don't like saying yes before I've read a manuscript. I have before, but I just read it, and I remember thinking, wow, this is a really cool idea. I have no idea how I'm going to illustrate it, but this is awesome. And so, yeah, and then that's basically how I got involved with it. I'd worked with Chad, the art director, before, so I think Chad kind of passed along my name, and that's how I got involved.
So you saw the manuscript before you said yes. Did Robert pitch you the idea and said, are you even interested, before sending the manuscript? I've always wondered how that works, or if it was kind of all at once.
It probably depends on the person. I can't remember. I know he pitched it in an email, but I can't remember if he sent it in that email, sent it as an attachment or not. But that's pretty normal that people, they'll send me the manuscript off the first email. So especially if, they need an answer soon, they'll just send it all at once.
Right. Saying yes without seeing it, that feels like a big gamble. I mean, because the concept could be really cool.
Yeah. My first book, I said yes before the manuscript was even done.
Did you?
Luckily, I liked it. Luckily, I was like, oh.
Right.
You know?
Well, what is your advice when it comes to that? Like how soon to say yes or when you should say yes?
For me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, well, it probably depends on what stage of your career. I mean, ideally, you want to work on something that really speaks to you. You know, if it doesn't speak to you, then you might want to consider saying no, unless you need to have a book under your belt. Then, you know, you can always make something cool, right? You can, even if the manuscript is lacking in some regard, or, I mean, if you're like, obviously, if there's something morally opposed to a manuscript, then that's a whole nother issue. But yeah, if you're just starting out, you know, and you just need something, you know, need some books, you know, you might not have as much leeway to say no, but, you know, obviously you can also fit it in your schedule. And there's those considerations as well. But, you know, for me, I feel like I know my style, I know my voice as an artist. So it's a lot easier to kind of discern where I feel like a story will fit in what I do and how I see the world. So it's a lot easier for me, you know, down the road. But I think for new artists, you know, just constantly being very aware of how you communicate as an artist is very important. You know, long-winded answer. Sure.
Oh, no, I love that. Thank you for that. That's what it's about, you know, for us to see how you guys feel about it, the artists, the creatives, the experts. Do you have any thoughts about that, John, what Josh just shared? How soon to say yes and trusting your instincts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different from the manuscript standpoint. You know, unless the process were to be reversed, which probably happens. I've never heard of it happening, starting as illustrations and then turning into a written story. With any creative project, it does have to speak with you, and it has to resonate with your life and how you see the world and how you look at things. And I think you don't need that to create, but you need that to create well. That's kind of my experience. So I'll come up with ideas for stories and I'll sit down and write them, and they either go in a completely different direction than I had planned, or I lose steam because it's not for me. It's not, you know, it's like it's a story for someone to tell, but it's not a story for me to tell. I think that's the best way to put it.
What kinds of conversations do you think the best children's books start?
That is a big question. Josh?
Oh gosh, there's so many things, so many factors. I do think there's a misconception that every book has to have this deep, like, meaning and moral. I don't know if that always has to be the case. I think sometimes there's something to be said about a book just being fun to read, so you can sit down, so a child is just excited to read it, you know, with their parents, or, you know, anyone else, and just getting them excited to read and tell stories or read stories. I think that's very valuable, you know. And then on top of that, you can build, you know, meaningful stories, meaningful dialogue. I think it's such an open-ended question, you know, thing to think about. I mean, yeah, I think it depends on where you're at, what you want to communicate, what story you want to tell, what, you know, I don't know. What do you think, John?
I think that makes sense. I mean, in one sense, I think the kind of conversation that should come out of a picture book is a conversation. And whether that's just as simple as, this book was so funny, page 8, I like this drawing, or I really like this funny word, or it's just the joy of reading. I've read a lot of great books that do have kind of a strong underlying moral or message. But I think when I write, I don't ever sit down with that as the goal, to teach something or to clarify something. Even with the end, it was, this is a really interesting concept that I can't really wrap my mind around. So let's see where that goes. Let's explore that idea. let's explore the idea of endings and beginnings. And I think you can read it and take away a message from it. But I also think you can read it and just kind of enjoy this fun back and forth between endings and beginnings throughout the book. And as long as you get to the last page, you close the cover, and there's something that children want to talk about with their parents, or they want to go back to, or they want to read it again, to me, that's the conversation.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think something that comes out of books that's really valuable is showing that children aren't alone, that there's other people, whether it's deep stuff or just silly stuff, that kids deal with every day. I think that's very valuable. And like with the end, dealing with this concepts of endings and beginnings that could be scary and fun at the same time, and just showing that kids aren't alone in dealing with that. I think that's very valuable.
Absolutely. Plus you added that larger, the manuscript had a lot of little endings and little beginnings, and you kind of added this big overarching end and beginning. So it really then covers like the whole spectrum. And there's such a variety that, if, maybe you don't relate, maybe a child doesn't relate to every page, but they relate to enough of the pages that they feel seen on those pages, to carry them through. That's a great point.
Yeah. By the way, how did you come up with the scenes that you feel would resonate with kids when writing the book, like the different places that it takes place?
When writing, it was, I don't want to say trial and error, but so the book is it's less than 400 words. I don't remember the total word count, but my first draft of it was like 900 or 1,000. And it just had so many endings and beginnings, and I explored them in greater depth. And part of that is because without any illustrations, I needed to understand what was involved in the ending and what was involved in the beginning. So even, those original drafts, I needed to know what the main character was eating. It helped me to know what they were eating and then what they might have for snack or dessert. But then eventually I just kind of cut it back and cut it back and cut it back. I gutted it, honestly, and tried to think of how I could convey it clearly enough without adding any specifics that would make it hard for someone to relate. Because not everybody eats a peanut butter sandwich for lunch. Not everybody does these certain things, but if you can my goal was to try and latch on to, I guess, more concrete everyday things, to try and capture just those, not mundane, but kind of just those regular moments.
Understood. Yeah. And Josh, when you're illustrating, are you looking to tell a story of your own, or are you just committed to telling the author's story?
The first thing I try to do is make sure that I honor the manuscript and honor the story. And then on top of that, I feel like my goal or my job is to really expand on the world that the manuscript has started. And sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder. Sometimes there's art notes that kind of guide me on that process. And sometimes there's very little at all, and it's really up to me. With this book, this manuscript, I think there were very little, maybe even there were no art notes. It was just the words. And so it really provided an opportunity for me to really actually create a story within John's story. And so that story just came about just some back and forth with sketches with Allison and Chad. I would send some storyboards and they would have some ideas on top of that based on what I'd done. But yeah, so I think it really provided an opportunity to tell a story within a story in this one. So it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to illustrate.
And you almost kind of had to tell that story within a story, which I didn't even fully realize, I think, because, my head had already kind of visually built it out in some amorphous kind of way. But I didn't really realize until I saw kind of the first spreads, like the beginning of the book is just, it is the beginning with no details on what what kind of a beginning that is. So you could have started with a white page because there was nothing there. So you had to decide which direction you wanted to take it, which I could have left you some art note, but you really, you ran with it in such an incredible way. But it was interesting for me to realize how much I had filled in visually without fully realizing it, but without any specifics. I just knew intuitively what the beginning was, but for you to read it, it's anything. It's anything and nothing, I guess I would imagine.
Yeah, I get, yeah. The concept of the ends and the beginnings in kiddom, in kid world. Most of it, at least here, we really center it around the school year, right? In summer. So I just felt like that was a good way of anchoring kind of the story. And then in between that, I have all these beginnings and endings throughout the summer, moving into the fall and the winter. And that whole overarching story actually was something that kind of developed over time as I sketched, storyboarded, sent stuff off to Chad and Allison, and then and it was just a lot of back and forth. This manuscript, we could have gone in so many different ways. We could have set it in space if we wanted to. It could have been the main character. It could have been a bug. It could have been all sorts of things. And sometimes I'm like, it'd be fun to take the same manuscript and illustrate it 5 different ways. If I had nothing else to do,
right?
I'm just like, let's just create 5 different versions of the end.
Yeah, no, that'd be interesting. Had you explored anything significantly different than this early on? Had you thought about space or a bug or something just completely separate?
I was pretty committed to a human character, a boy or a girl, and I think I was already illustrating a book about talking vegetables and other so I think I was like, okay, let's do a book about people. But also it was actually right in the middle of the pandemic, and I feel like it kind of goes back to some of our earlier points. I feel like I wanted to create something that was very relatable. So in doing that, we had to, we created the character as a human, as a girl. And initially, my initial sketches, it didn't even show the character's face. It was just the character the face was hidden with pillows and different things like that. And Allison was, she looked at it and she's like, yeah, let's add the character's face just to show, just for that greater relatability. And I was like, so I did a few sketches and yep, this is the right way to go.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, one of the spreads in there actually is from my very original one, where she actually, you don't see her face at all, and so I did keep 1 or 2 of those. But
I'm glad you added. Some of your facial expressions are so good on the main character. They're so good.
Thank you.
It's one of my favorite things.
I think that was so important with the story. With the concept of the endings and the beginnings. So yeah, I think that was the right call on Allison's part.
Yeah. John, when you look at the visuals that go along with your writing, are you like, wow, this exceeded my expectations, or this is what I had in mind? How does that feel?
This is one of my favorite questions because people ask it a lot, because a lot of people, you did. And a lot of people, I think, just don't realize that, Josh and I don't talk during this process. So when they find that out, well, how can you do that? How can you trust someone to do this? What is that like? And it's weird because I think I said earlier, I had a clear idea in my head of how this story would look visually. But if you were to ask me to explain that idea to you, I couldn't. Because I think it was just a feeling of what this story would be. So when I saw the early sketches, all at one time, it was everything I could have hoped for, and also nothing I had imagined, all at once. Because I didn't really know where I landed on it. And I think the fact that, again, it has just that, Josh just anchored it in this school and season element that I hadn't considered when I was writing it. And I think it exceeded my expectations, because I guess I didn't realize what could be done in and around that manuscript. And it just expanded so significantly with the art. But it was nerve-wracking, because you're handing over, kind of a child, a thing that you created, to someone that you've never met, that other people tell you will treat it nicely. And then you just wait. So there is that element. If we were to do another book together, I would have zero hesitation, zero doubts, because I just know. But when you don't know the person, and you don't have the opportunity to even sit with them and say, well, this is what I envision, this is, my feeling toward the story, you really don't know. And I know it's kind of rambly, but it's a weird thing to try and, wrap your mind around, I think.
You're not rambling at all. That's great. To go off by the feeling. Wow. And you did mention if you guys were to collaborate again. So would you guys collaborate again? And if so, would you have to follow that routine of not keeping in contact? It would depend if it was an indie publishing or a trade publisher.
Yeah, I think it would depend. I'm sure there are, author illustrator pairs who have some communication, but I know I've listened to interviews as well. I listened to one with Mac Barnett and John Clausen, and they would communicate, but it was very clear that they were not regularly talking about it, and Mac wasn't regularly giving art direction, and they weren't really collaborating. I think they connected more than Josh and I did, but I really think kind of for the author to release that creative control is incredibly important, because every book kind of has three stories. It has the written story and the visual story, and then the story that they tell together. And if you have the author write it and then tell the illustrator what they see or what they want to see, you crush at least one, if not two, of those stories.
Okay.
Yeah. I definitely would. Short answer is yes. Of course I would work with you, do another book with you. I think it would be great. But I think from an illustrator's perspective, I've done independent books where, the author reaches out to me directly, and then we collaborate and create together, and sometimes that's a good process, but sometimes it can go bad because the author is too invested in what they want to see. It's kind of like, John, what you just said, I know what I want, I know what I envision, but I can't really talk about it, so just give me a bunch of sketches and then I'll tell you when you get close. So sometimes that can happen. So it requires a very special relationship, like you mentioned, John Clausen. Of course, he's a children's publishing legend, so he could do whatever he wants.
Right. Yeah. They both are. So I figure when they get together, the publishers just say,
In fact, I think I saw them both at a conference, illustration conference a few years ago, speak at the same time, and they kind of talked about that. But yeah, it's there. When you get to a certain point, you can do whatever you want.
Right.
But if you built up that rapport of working together, then yeah, you develop a second hand, and you can really create some great things together. So, but yeah, that first book, sometimes that can be a little iffy.
Yeah.
You never know. When I'm illustrating somebody's first children's book, that's something that I'm very respectful of, and I'm honored to do that, because I know it's their baby, and they're giving it up like this. Their hands are like this. Okay, take it. And I'm like, don't worry. We'll do our best. We'll create something special. And so I'm always thinking about that. Like, okay, what's John thinking about this? And I hope he likes what I'm doing here. So.
Well, and for me, it was just remembering too. It was a project an illustrator wants to take these projects on. So you didn't decide to illustrate it, and every day you sit down at your desk and you sigh and you roll your eyes. You are as invested in it as I am. You know, and I think like remembering that, it's like, you're not just handing it off to someone who's going to get it done quickly and they don't really care. Like you're handing it off to someone who has the same end goal in mind as you do. You know, you just have different paths of getting there, I think. But I think part of it is like, I would definitely work with you again. I think part of it is though, it was luck in a sense that you had the capacity when they needed someone to illustrate the book. Like you could have had, you know, you were illustrating, you know, the produce at the time, and you could have had another book already lined up, and then you wouldn't have been around.
Yeah.
You know? So part of it is, I think,
True,
like that timing falls into place. And I don't remember who it was I was listening to, but it was a pair, an author and an illustrator, that are both really well known and have been friends for years and years and years. And it took them, I want to say, at least 10 years to actually do something together, because the timing just never worked out. You know, one of the author would have a manuscript ready, but the illustrator was too bogged down, and then they would have some available time, but there was no new manuscript ready. And it's the flow of things, I guess.
Yeah, it's a lot of work on both the illustrator and the author side. So getting those two lined up, and especially, you know, you've got publishing considerations and timelines. You know, you want to publish by the spring market or the fall market or whatever, you know, it's like the right things have to align. And even this one, I think they wanted me to start it like a couple months earlier. So Starry Forest was able to kind of work with me, you know, based on my schedule. So luckily you guys are flexible on your end.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it would have been interesting, you know, if it had been a couple months earlier, it would have coincided with the end of a school year.
Yeah.
Right. But now it coincides with the beginning of the school year. So it's like, because everything is so cyclical. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we were also, I think, fortunate just because you're right. I guess I didn't really realize that you probably first saw this manuscript, you know, in early 2021, which is kind of when I think everyone was like expecting that we'd already be done with the pandemic and the lockdowns, but we weren't, and you didn't really know what to do. Right. And I think that was also before we realized, well, this will definitely affect like shipping delays, production delay. It's going to do all of that. And I think we were really fortunate. You know, I know plenty of people who've had books pushed 3, 6, 9, 12 months because of, you know, paper availability or shipping or all these different things.
Yeah. The first book I worked on with Chad, it was like that. Like, it was an independent project with another company or another small little startup, and we definitely had some. And there was it wasn't just the book. There were other parts like a plushie toy and a map and things like that. And there were long delays. So yeah.
How are you hoping this book will make people feel the end?
I guess I'm hoping it makes them feel something. Whether they walk away from it, and obviously, you know, children and parents are going to walk away with very different feelings after the book, I'm guessing. And I just want them to walk away feeling something. So if they walk away feeling like deep in thought and that they hadn't considered something, that's great. If they walk away, you know, feeling really amused, that's great. It kind of breaks my heart when I read a book, whether it's a picture book or a chapter book, and you finish it and you just indifferent. You just feel indifferent. Like the book is done and I'm going to move on to the next thing. And I hope that's not what happens. Like, I hope they feel something. I hope they close the book and they feel something, feel different than they did when they opened it.
Ditto. Yeah. I mean, when I was illustrating the book, I started really thinking about the concept, and I've been thinking about the concept since, just in general, just whenever every small little thing, or if it's a big thing. And I think that's something that I hope other people get out of it. If it's a child, you know, and, you know, struggling with like, you know, transitions and things like that, then they just know that it's okay to struggle. You know, a lot of people struggle. I think that's really valuable. And same with adults. So, yeah.
I guess that's a really good point. I didn't want to diminish that an end is an end. Like, you don't want to ignore that something has ended just because something new is beginning. Like, so you might feel happy that it's ending, you might feel sad, you might be angry that it's ending. Like, you can have those feelings, but there is still a beginning. And you might have all of those feelings about the next beginning. You know, you might be angry that something is beginning, but there is then an end, and you might feel happy that that thing ended. So to kind of just acknowledge that there's all these different things that can happen individually, all at once, on both ends of an ending and a beginning. This is really difficult to talk about the two together, but yeah, that's a great point, Josh. Yeah, just to acknowledge that feeling state, I guess.
Yeah. And I think back to your initial inspiration with that song, I remember when that song came out, you know, I had just graduated from high school. So I was very into that, like, ending, beginning. I remember hearing that line, and I hear it all the time on the radio. And I think I realized it now after you mentioned it on our Instagram Live. I'm like, yeah, I think that line really struck with me back then. And I feel like this book, illustrating this book in the middle of the pandemic, has kind of stuck with me too, you know, because we're all kind of having to, like, we all are kind of facing our own endings and beginnings, however big or small those are. I think it's an important thing to think about. And I hope people at least think about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Okay, guys, have to also get your advice for anybody watching this, because I know there are a lot of people who aspire to be authors and or illustrators. So what is the best advice that you can give to those people?
Just keep creating, keep writing. I have yet to meet anyone who is an author or an illustrator or an author illustrator who doesn't have a story about it being a long road getting to where they're at. And that doesn't mean it's a bad road, but even some of the biggest names in children's publishing and adult publishing, you know, they had 5, 10, 15 years of writing stories that didn't go anywhere, writing stories that never sold, or reaching out to agents that never responded, or it's part of the process. And the way that I always look at it is every rejection or every no just means you're in the game. Like, you're doing the work to get there. And if you're not getting rejections, you're not doing the work. You're not doing your creative work and putting it out there. So it's part of it. You know, it's not easy. And I don't know that it necessarily gets any easier to receive, but it gets easier to move on.
Yeah, definitely. It's like the overnight success that took a week or took a year or took 10 years, you know? Yeah. I mean, I would say the same thing. Just keep creating. For me, like, specific advice, like if for a young illustrator just starting out, I always tell them, especially if they're, like, you know, high school, moving into college, kind of at the very beginning of their career, or thinking about wanting to be an illustrator, is really think about and really pay attention to how people react to your work, and really think about what specific things people are saying about your work. Like, does it make them laugh? Does it make them cry? Like, in a good way, like cry? Does it make them, you know, not like, oh, this is so bad, but, you know, does it make them think? Are you able to communicate an idea really well? Do you know, can you sell a product? Can you do this? And as you start to put those pieces together and think about those things and pay attention to those things, you can really see where your work really fits in to the market. And even with children's books, there's such a variety of different ways. You know, you can draw silly pictures, you can draw, you know, things that really make you think, things that make you really, you know, contemplate big concepts like racial issues or things like that. You know, so really just pay attention to what people are saying about your work when people give you a compliment. You know, maybe even write them down, create a journal, you know, something. Yeah. You know, so that's some specific advice that I like to give people.
I like that. And I think it's similar with writing, but I guess I would add, like,
definitely. Yeah.
You know, you pay attention to them and you write them down and you save them, but then you also you reach a point, I think, maybe early on, like, you take them all and you kind of let them mold you in these different ways. But then you reach a point where you have to decide which of those reactions not which you care about, but like which matter to you. Like maybe, one person really didn't like this thing, and that's fine. Like that's not your audience, because you start to you build yourself, and then you figure out your audience, and person A and person C are not going to like this, but person B is going to love it.
Yeah,
and you
yeah,
just
definitely.
but you have to know yourself to get to that point, right?
Yeah. I've heard it described as like there's an intersection, like the work that you love to do, and then there's the market, and finding that like intersection of the thing that makes you come alive and what people will resonate with. So I think that's a big part.
Right. And also not getting, I think there's a separate intersection, like something that you're good at, but you don't necessarily like doing. Like I have to, because I freelance, right? So I'll get projects, and I know that I can accomplish these projects, and I know that the end product will be great. And I also know that I do not enjoy it. But the more people figure out that you could do it and the end product is good, the more those projects come to you. So you have to decide, how far do you want to lean into that space? Or do you really want to abandon that intersection, in pursuit of that, that thing you like?
Yeah, I guess this is the thing that you love doing and you're good at. Yeah. So, and I think it all comes back to like your initial advice of just creating. Just the more you create, the more data you have.
Right.
Pay attention. A lot of people don't even know what they like doing, so paying attention to what lights you up.
I've also heard, I think for both writing and for art, like this idea of essentially copying someone else's style, and then someone else's, and then someone else's, to the point where you've copied so many styles that you've found your own, right? So obviously not plagiarizing, but you really like this person's art, so you kind of try to imitate that style, but then this person's art catches your eye and you try to do that, and gradually it just shapes you into the style that you create, into the voice you have in your stories, into the art that shows up on the page.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree with that. Yeah, especially if you're not plagiarizing, then I think that's a great tool to do. That's what I tell young artists to do sometimes. Like draw Spider-Man, draw comic book characters that you love drawing, and don't worry about copying, as long as you're not saying it's your own. Right. I think that's really valuable. I mean, musicians do it.
Right.
They have no problem like taking a piece of music that somebody else wrote and playing it. I mean, that's how they learn.
Right.
So I think artists and writers, and learning your voice, learning, what you love to do. I mean, that's kind of what I did as a kid. I loved Calvin and Hobbes. I loved Charles Schulz, Peanuts characters, and other comic strips. So that's kind of where I started, building my artistic voice. And then, it just builds from there. Not very many original ideas out there. It's just a bunch of combinations of this stuff.
Right.
Very true. John, who were some of your influences?
Oh, in general, that's a great question. I love Mac Barnett's writing. I always have, from the very beginning. I like the way that he looks at the world. And I think just his approach to this genuine sense of make-believe, I really enjoy. So that's always pulled me in. I mean, I had books as a kid, like, I don't know anyone in the children's book space who doesn't really like Where the Wild Things Are. But I tend to gravitate toward books that are very concise, that try and tell a story in as few words as possible. For some reason, it interests me, I think, just because of the challenge. So if I pick up a book and it's, got a sentence per page or less. Suzy Lee is an illustrator that I really like, and she's done a couple wordless picture books, like Wave and Shadow. And just the way that she conveys story without any words, just through her art, it's stunning. It's beautiful stuff. So I think that's been another thing, like this idea of the wordless picture book. My art is nowhere near at a level where I could create a wordless picture book, but trying to look at wordless picture books and imagine what the words could be on those pages has been really helpful for me, in that pursuit of brevity, I guess.
What about the opposite? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
DJ, BJ Novak's.
Oh.
Have you seen
Book
his?
with no picture.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was such a brilliant idea. And the reason I like that book is because one thing I try to think about as I write is like you obviously want to think about the story and like the page turns and what's on every page. But I like to think about how every page, sounds weird, how every page feels to say. Like when you read it in your head and when you read it out loud, like how do those words feel in your mouth? And it's something I think about. Because you can get really awkward, especially for something that is like probably 90% of the time going to be read aloud. If the words don't feel fun in your mouth, like they become laborious to read, they become boring. Like those are the pages that the parents try to skip. Maybe they won't know if I just turn 2 pages at once. So I try to think about that, like how it feels to say them.
So when people are creating, who should they show? Does it matter who they show? If they're showing family, friends, or do they need to show professionals and experts?
Josh, what's your take on this?
I think you have to know who you're showing it to. If you trust your family and friends, I think, definitely show them. I think both, honestly. If you know someone's going to be a sourpuss, then don't show them. But on the same hand, don't be afraid of getting some, negative feedback. When I was a kid, I had my own comic strip, and I would show my parents. I would show my dad. I would write out a comic strip, and I would show it to him before I draw it. And sometimes he would give me some harsh criticism, but he did it with the best intention, and he was my biggest fan. But so I learned early on to kind of to not hold what I did so tightly that I didn't want to show anybody. Showing people is important. If you're writing a children's book, I think probably showing parents and librarians and teachers. He was also my dad's. He's a retired school teacher. He would read aloud books all the time. So that's one of his big criteria. You can read aloud very easily. So showing it to somebody like that, I think, is really valuable.
Yeah, I think it's great to have like a family that does that. I think it's easy to fall into a trap of like, I show all my family and friends and they love everything I do. Like, I guarantee you that not everything you do, this sounds terrible, but not everything you do is lovable, because you're not going to create only flawless things. So you need to find people that you trust to tell you when it's not what it could be, or to tell you, you have you thought about this, to give you constructive criticism. Like, you don't want the sourpuss who just hates everything, but they need to be able to say, I really like this idea, I don't really like this, or have you thought about taking it in that direction? Those people will shape you as a creative more than the people who love your work, I think.
Yeah, just showing it to my mom. If I just want to pat on the back, here you go.
Right. Yeah. Those people have value. Like I do the same thing. Don't get caught in that trap of only those people. I think that's where, and I think that's what makes it scary to go to the professionals, because you think, well, my friends really like it, but all the professionals will hate it, and they won't all hate it, but they're not all going to love it as a blanket statement. It won't happen. Even some of the best selling books out, there are plenty of editors, illustrators, authors that don't like them because it's not the audience,
That's very true. Have any kids gotten the chance to look at the end? And if so, what are their thoughts? Look at it, read it.
A couple have. I had a really great experience. I was talking to a local place here about an event, and the manager, we finished our meeting and I was just kind of hanging out, and her daughter came in and heard about me being there, and I had an advanced copy of the book, and her daughter really wanted to read it. She read it, and then her mom brought it back and said she's very excited because she's the first person to ever read this book. Well, yes, please let her continue to believe that. Like, I think that's great. And she really enjoyed it. She loved the book. Like, I think it was part of the idea was cool that it was like this unique experience. But yeah, the kids that have read it have all really enjoyed it. My son is 18, and I'm pretty sure he read it and said cool, and then went on with his day. But that was fine. Yeah, it's been really, really positive. I mean, they've all also been children of friends. So again, it's kind of that audience of like, I expect that they would say that, even if maybe there was something they didn't love about it. So when it gets into hands of unknown children, that's what I'm most excited about, to hear what they think. You know, to read it to a group of kids and have one of them say, you know, I didn't like this page. I didn't like the way that it ended, or I didn't like this or that. I like that. I like those comments and those questions. I think it's great.
I think it's always fun to see how kids, I mean, they're the ones we're writing and drawing for, and just to see how they react to it. Sometimes, like, I actually love it more when, like, a child that I don't have a personal relationship with, like, you know, someone that's out there responds very favorably to what I've created. I actually enjoy that a lot more than like an adult complimenting me on my work. I just think that's more special, you know. I just love it. I mean, for one of my other books, I got a letter in the mail where it was just some kids who had drawn me a picture from like Minnesota or somewhere. I'm just outside of Portland, Oregon, but they'd taken the time to write what they liked about the book and then send me this note. And I just thought it was the coolest thing, you know, more than a critic, more than a peer or anything like that. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
The fact they took the time to make art and to write and put it in an envelope and send it. And you know that was such a cool experience for them to think about.
Yeah.
That this person whose book I have is going to read this thing and look at this thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And their mom, I mean, she was just really cool. I think she's kind of, you know, she just loves books too. So yeah. I think she spurred that on. And then I think I sent them an autographed copy of the book back or something, put their names in it. And yeah, it's a fun experience.
Guys, it has been a pleasure. On that note, John Bray and Josh Cleland and John Bray, The End, a children's book that you definitely have to check out, published by Story Forest Books. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on So Booking Cool today. Really enjoyed you. Please let everyone know how they can keep up with you and get the book. And also, are there going to be any visits, author visits, whether that's virtual, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely will be. The two that are planned currently are local. I'm outside of Chicago in St. Charles, Illinois. There's a reading in early September 10th, at Harvey's Tales in Geneva. There's another event. I don't have finalized details yet, but in early October. But to keep up with me, to learn about those events, you can visit my website, which is johnbraybooks.com. And then I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at JHNRBRY. So John R. Bray without the vowels.
Yeah, guys, make sure you do that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a couple events in the works. Maybe some library things going on here locally. They're still in the planning stages. But you can follow me. My website is joshcleland.com. Instagram and Twitter is at Josh Cleland, all one word. Instagram is actually probably the thing I'm most active on.
Yeah, and then you can pre-order, or, you know, depending on when you hear this, you can order the book basically anywhere that you would buy books. I always like to point people toward their favorite indie bookstore, but you know, plenty of options. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all over the place.
Absolutely. And I would love to speak with you guys again in the future, because you guys give a great interview and there's so much to ask you guys. Like, there really is, you know.
Well, this was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad
Lots of fun.
All right. Thank you guys, to all the viewers, to all the listeners. Until next time, So Booking Cool.